Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 4 game from the Xtracon Open. Now, if you followed the round 3 video, you know that I won my 3rd game in a row to still remain undefeated, and I'd played down all 3 rounds so far, but I knew I'd be playing up in this one because there weren't as many undefeated players as there were a few rounds ago. So on 3-0, I knew I'd be facing a strong Grandmaster. It turned out that my opponent in this one would be none other than Grandmaster Alexander Moiseenko, who's actually a well-known player on the world chess scene because in the early 2010s, he was actually in the top 30 in the world, and his peak rating, I believe, was around 2720, in which he was around basically in the top 25 in the world. So very, very strong player from Ukraine, and obviously a really, really tough opponent, particularly with black. But this game actually would turn out to be one of the most spectacular games I've ever played. So buckle up your seatbelts because this one was really, really a fun one. So anyways, he opened with d4 as he normally does. He's typically a d4 and c4 player, which, is quite unusual as far as at the top level. Normally, chess players are actually more universal, so typically the higher up you go, they tend to play almost everything. But there are a few players that still pretty much are devoted to, one or two particular systems, and, he was actually one of them that rarely plays e4. And this actually worked to my advantage as far as preparation is concerned, because I know I can kind of shut down one complete set of, lines and variations as far as e4 is concerned. So anyway, after d4, I went with d5, and now white went c4, and I went e6, willing to play a queen's gambit declined. As you know, if you've followed some of the games on this channel, I've used the queen's gambit declined quite successfully in the past, and it's kind of something that I'm quite comfortable playing. Now, I didn't know what variation he would play here. I mean, he's, he can play the Catalan, he could play knight c3. There are many different lines here, but he actually went for knight c3, going for, potentially keeping things still flexible, not committing necessarily to a Catalan. And I went knight f6 to follow up. And this move invites the next sequence of moves, which he actually did, facilitating the Queen's Gambit exchange variation, because he went c takes d5, and then I played e takes d5, and then bishop g5 was played. And the Queen's Gambit exchange is one of the most topical lines of the Queen's Gambit, and has a very, very rich history. For many, many years, players of the past, including Kasparov and Karpov, have employed this system with white. And so it'll actually give me an opportunity to talk about some of the lines here that have been played in the past. So typically after bishop g5, most players actually go c6, and this is actually what I elected to do. And then white actually went e3, and the idea with e3 is actually to stop bishop f5. So basically with c6, bishop f5 becomes an idea, and typically you would love to have the bishop on this diagonal because it actually kind of keeps the rook in check. It stops from going to b1, slows down the minority attack. And that typically is something that happens in the structure where white has a kingside pawn majority and black has a queenside pawn majority. But the reason that a lot of white players are quite comfortable playing this position is because the argument is that white's kingside majority is actually easier to mobilize than black's queenside majority. And so typically what happens is that, if black tries to go for a c5 break, he either gives himself hanging pawns or an isolated pawn on d5. And because of that, c5 is something that black is kind of reluctant to do, whereas white, on the other hand, can sometimes build up to play the e4 break. And that's something that really comes into play quite a bit. It's actually known as the Botvinnik plan in the position, where white essentially builds up to play e4, take more control of the center, and then kind of steamroll black through the middle with his pawns. So c6 entertains bishop f5. So anyways, e3 is played typically, and the idea here is that it actually stops bishop f5. Now, bishop f5 is still playable, but it's not played very often because after bishop f5, white actually has this move queen f3 that's extremely annoying. And the point is that, white actually ruins black's pawn structure and gives them double pawns. And after bishop g6, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and then this subsequent exchange actually gives white a very, very pleasant position in endgame, because these double pawns are kind of a static weakness that are tough to get over. Now, there are some strong grandmasters that have played this position and are quite comfortable defending it. Nigel Short was actually someone that really pioneered this particular line for black. One of the main ideas is to go knight b8 to d7 to b8 to to b6 to c8 to d6, and essentially getting that knight to d6 gives black reasonable control of the center and of the minority attack that typically comes with b4 and b5. But in my opinion, this setup is quite difficult to play as black, and there's one game in particular that stood out to me a few years back. If you look up Carlsen versus Kramnik in this particular line, Carlsen basically won a positional masterpiece in this particular variation. So it's kind of discouraged a lot of black players from going into this territory. So anyways, e3 kind of stops bishop f5. And now, because of e3, typically there are two questions in this position. One question is where black is going to put their bishop on f8. Are they going to put it on e7? Or are they going to put it on d6? Typically, the idea has been to put the bishop on e7 for many years and to break the pin on the knight on f6. So typically after bishop e7, bishop d3 is played to take control of the f5 square, that diagonal. And then you have scenarios where there's like castles, queen c2, and the game proceeds along a different course. Now, the other question for white actually is where to put the king's knight. So you can put it on e2, and if you put it on e2, white is able to facilitate the Botvinnik plan with f3 and e4 later on. Or you can put it on f3. And on f3, you take away the opportunity to play the Botvinnik plan with f3 and e4, but you entertain, you tend to entertain the minority attack with the knight on f3 with rook b1 and b4. And it's actually funny because both plans are very viable, and Kasparov was a huge proponent of the Botvinnik plan by putting the knight on e2 and playing f3 and e4. Karpov, on the other hand, was a huge proponent of putting the knight on f3 and just going rook b1 and b4. And it's kind of interesting because both of these very strong grandmasters and past world champions actually scored over 90% with white in their particular setup. But they definitely had different styles about going about playing the position. And it just goes to show you there are different ways to play chess effectively. So there are basically two different ways that white can go for it here. Now, back to black's setup in terms of how black can handle this position, I actually elected to play bishop d6. And this is a very, very unique and relatively modern approach to the setup in the Carlsbad structure, because typically here the bishop does go to e7, but I had a very, very particular idea in mind, and we'll see that a bit later. So after bishop d6, I'm not breaking this pin. So this pin is still present, and you might ask, what's the bishop doing on d6? Well, for starters, it's on a little bit of a more active diagonal, right? When you put it on e7, it's typically purely a defensive piece. You can see d6 here is already pointing towards white kingside pawn. So keep that in mind. So after bishop d6, white played bishop d3. This is normal. Again, covering this diagonal, in particular the f5 square, taking it away from the light squared bishop. And now I castled. And now white played queen c2. And this is a very typical idea in the structure to have this queen c2 and bishop d3 battery along the h7 pawn, because it actually immediately threatens that pawn. Note that bishop takes h7 check is a move because my knight is pinned. So here I actually needed to play h6. And here now the bishop retreated to h4. Moiseenko went back to h4. Note that putting it on f4 would be kind of ill-advised because I can capture on f4 and then play rook e8 check with a very satisfactory game. So after h6, bishop h4, now I actually went for rook e8, and this is another key move that's part of my plan, because typically in these types of setups, white might entertain playing the Botvinnik plan with f3 and play that move actually before he even castles. So by playing rook e8, I actually take away f3 as a potential option, and in some lines, I actually just train the rook against the king on e1 right away. So it's just a useful kind of waiting move, because typically the rook does want to go to the e8 square, where it sort of fights for control of the important squares on the e file that are contested by white and black. So after rook e8, white went knight ge2, and I could see here quite clearly that he's going for the Botvinnik plan, because the knight is on e2 as opposed to on f3. So clearly he's kind of gearing up potentially for f3 and e4 at some juncture later in the game. Now I introduced a very, very rare idea in conjunction with bishop d6, and this is the move a5. And this move is the beginning of a long and kind of extended journey with the knight that we'll see momentarily. But the idea with a5 is also quite clever from the standpoint that it kind of discourages white from castling queenside. So in certain positions, especially because I haven't broken the pin on the knight on f6 and I've played h6, I've given white kind of a hook on the g5 square because my pawn is on h6. So there could be a scenario where he castles queenside and plays g4, g5, even if it's at the cost of a pawn, just to kind of pry open the g file, because I have created a hook. And by playing a5, I kind of discourage him from castling queenside. The other thing that's important about a5 is it's a very effective waiting move, because castling kingside is actually impossible. If you castle kingside, you actually run into bishop takes h2 check. And you can actually see here the issue with the bishop on h4 being undefended, because after king takes h2, I actually have knight g4 check, and we almost have this Greek gift idea, as it's called, that allows me to draw the king out into the open, because if you go back to g1, I just take on h4 with mate to follow. So you have to come out into the open with a move like king g3, and here I can actually play g5. And all of a sudden, this king on g3 is extremely, extremely airy. I'm going to recover my bishop that I sacrificed, and I'm going to have a pretty interesting initiative here on the king side. So actually, a5 is also an important waiting move, kind of asking white an important question. How's he going to deal with his next move? Because castling is impossible. So it also gives white the opportunity to kind of mess it up. And here, white actually played the move h3, which is quite sensible, because you actually want to stop bishop takes h2 checks, and at least now castling is an option. But h3 is also a move that is kind of double-edged from the standpoint that it actually creates a hook for me. So if you look at the position now, I actually have a lever with which to pry open the white king side, and that becomes a very, very important factor. So after white played h3, I played knight a6, and this is the other critical point of a5, is I maybe could have played knight a6 right away before a5, but if I do that, white has the option of going bishop takes a6. And even though the computer actually deems that this position is playable, this pawn structure on the queen side, these double pawns on the a file, in particular the backward c pawn, is really, really ugly and I believe difficult to play. So the point is I play the move a5, and now after I play knight a6, I can actually recapture with the rook if white feels compelled to capture. So basically, a5 discouraged castling. It also was an important waiting move that provoked h3, and it facilitated knight a6 without doubling my pawns. So after knight a6, the threat is actually knight b4, and you can see getting the bishop pair there would be quite good for black. So white is well advised to actually play a3 and stop the knight b4 idea. But you can see here that castling on the queen side is absolutely out of the question for white now, because with the move a3, white has actually created a hook or a lever for me to potentially play b4 at a later juncture if white did elect to go kingside or queenside. So he wouldn't actually be secure there. So this actually kind of gives me a nice half tempo to consider my plan on the king side. So after a3, I went knight c7. And now this is the beginning or the continuation of that journey with the knight. And actually the idea is to bring this knight towards the king side where, because this move h3 was played, creating a little hook, it gives me added attacking chances on that side of the board. And so it's actually extremely unique idea. And this exact position with a3 and knight a6 had only been played once before, I think like 15 years ago or something, or almost 20 years ago. And in fact, I actually did not even know this was played 20 years ago before this game. I'd actually came up with this idea on my own 6 months before this game. And it was quite funny that Moiseenko basically went into this line that I'd seriously investigated. But it's also because it's quite rare. This idea with bishop d6, bishop d6 is not at all the most popular move. And this, when conjunction with a5 and knight a6, is just basically a novelty. So very, very rare idea, and I think that's also, worked in my favor. So anyways, after knight c7, now white actually castled, and now I went knight e6. And my point is to drag this knight closer to the king side and to get some play there. The other thing about the knight on g5 is it actually controls the e4 square. So you can see here with my knight coming closer to g5, I'm actually fighting and contesting that square that is the one that white typically executes the e4 break on with f3 and e4 in the Botvinnik plan. So after knight e6, white actually went f3. And this move is consistent with the Botvinnik plan, but is actually not the best idea in this particular setup. Now, the position is not, bad yet, but you can see in the most natural plan here actually doesn't work, and we're going to see that momentarily. The other thing with f3 is you actually create more weaknesses. So if you actually just think about the squares adjacent to f3, now e3 is, temporarily sensitive, and g3 is a little bit more sensitive as well. Even though, white has two pieces covering it, you always want to think about these types of weaknesses. So after f3, I now played knight g5, and you could see here now my rook on e8 is unleashed on the e3 pawn, and, it's pretty much, white has to make a decision about what to do with that pawn because it's actually a target. And there's actually really not a ton of great choices. So if you make a move like bishop f2, trying to just protect that pawn, I actually can entertain bishop takes h3, g takes h3, and knight takes h3, check. And a position like this could actually be quite dangerous for black because if you play king takes f2, I actually have knight g4 check and queen h4, and you could see all the pieces are coming in to deliver a mating attack. And if you go rook takes f2, I have rook takes e3, and at the very least now I have 4 pawns for the piece, and the dark squares are extremely weak in white's camp. So bishop f2 is not really necessarily a great idea. Another idea you could entertain is a move like queen d2, protecting this pawn. But this is also extremely risky because there are some sacrifices that may be looming on h3. And also you drag a piece away from the e4 square, which is actually where you want to push the pawn anyway. And so it's actually getting less protection for the e4 thrust. It turns out here that the most appropriate move here is probably f4, just trying to kick my knight back and discourage me from my aggressive intentions, because sacking on h3 now is not as spectacular. I could take, but after and then take on at e3, but here after bishop h7 check, king h8, and bishop f5, white actually gets the opportunity to trade my really good bishop on c8 that was eyeing the white king side. So in this type of position, my compensation here, even though I got a few pawns for the piece, my compensation here is a little bit dubious because white, has the opportunity to consolidate. So anyways, f4 is probably the most logical, and after f4, I could just go knight e6 back and actually argue that now e4 is not something I'm as afraid of because it's not supported by the f pawn, and in the short term, the e3 pawn would be a backward pawn, a potential target for my pieces. So the position is actually very, very playable from here. So, yeah. Another thing I want to point out before showing the game continuation is if bishop takes g5, after h takes g5, white does have the opportunity to play the e4 thrust, but black's actually pretty fine here because I have the two bishops, and these dark squares in the white position are quite sensitive, and so actually e4 is a move, but I can actually even play something like c5 and start to undermine tactically these dark squares. Note that if e5, I can just take on d4 and pretty much have a satisfactory position because I'm recovering my piece whichever way white captures on f6 or d6. So anyways, after f3, knight g5, white actually made the fatal mistake. And the funny thing about this position is the move that Moiseenko made is actually so natural. It's the totally natural move to make in this position, but it turns out that the particular conditions here don't allow for it. And the natural-looking move that loses is actually e4. Well, why does it lose, you may ask? Well, because it's a spectacular flurry of tactics, and it's basically based upon the fact that this h3 pawn that had to be played earlier because of the bishop h2 check threat has created a hook for my pieces to actually latch onto and attack. And so in this position after e4, I actually was able to play the spectacular knight f takes e4. And the idea here is that after f takes e4, which was played, I actually got to play knight takes h3 check. And what's the idea of these sacrifices, you may ask? Well, the point is to rip open the white king side and also secure the bishop on h4. So after g takes h3 and queen takes h4, we have a situation where I already have two pawns for the piece, and I have two bishops screaming down the diagonal to support my attack. And the real issue here is that white's pieces are just a little bit too clumsy to really, deal right now. And the position's actually completely lost. Now, another very natural move in this position, and one you might consider with white, would be the move e5. Well, why doesn't e5 work? Doesn't this shut down this diagonal with tempo, attack the bishop, force me back? Then white might be able to play bishop f5 and trade these bishops like in that previous line with bishop h7 check, king h8, and then bishop f5. Well, it turns out here the spectacular fireworks continue because e5 does not work on account of rook takes e5. And this is actually the real issue, is that you can't shut down this diagonal because after d takes e5, I actually go bishop c5 check, and I'm able to deliver mate. Because king g2, queen takes h3 check is actually mate, and you can see how white is just getting destroyed on the diagonals. And so after bishop c5 check, knight d4 would be forced, but this doesn't really change very much. I could take on d4 check. The king still can't step up because queen h3 is mate, and the only thing white can do is interpose with the rook. But now, well, there are just a million threats in this position, but one of the more attractive might be queen g3 check. That's pretty sufficient. Also, bishop takes h3 as well is an option, entertaining queen g3 check next. And it's just totally lost. So basically, you can't shut down the diagonal with e5, and that's really where you start to realize that white's position is just critical. So after queen h4, Moiseenko did what is probably the most sensible given the circumstance, is to play rook f2. And the idea is I'm going to jettison my h3 pawn as well, but try to, bring the rook to the second rank, shield the king in that way. And this gave me the option to actually just take on h3 and secure a third pawn, and now bring my bishop from c8 into the attack. So, the attack is still raging. And so after bishop takes h3, I felt really, really good about my chances. And actually, I must say, I actually knew that this position was winning. So I didn't just feel really good about my chances. I knew that I was coming up on something pretty special here, because the position, the sacrifice with knight takes h3, I'd actually had analyzed at home like 6 months ago. So anyways, after bishop takes h3, white actually played rook d1. And again, the reason he actually tried to do this is because e5 still doesn't work. If e5, I just go rook takes e5, and after d takes e5, bishop c5 is just decisive. This pin is just too much for white to handle, and yeah, it's just a huge problem. So instead, rook d1 was played, trying to kind of, I assume, maybe try to support the rook on the second rank at some point, maybe waiting on me to make some decision. And here I actually played probably the most spectacular move of the game, and the one that I think people really will remember for a long time. And the move is actually rook e5. And I cannot tell you how amazing it was, how it felt to actually play this move over the board against someone that is so strong, because it was something that I'd been kind of, we'd both kind of had known was a possibility if he pushed his pawn to e5, because that sacrifice was always looming, was rook takes e5 and bishop c5. But here, the move is remarkably effective, because what it does is it forces white to deal with the threat of rook g5 check. And really, the other thing is that after the pawn recaptures, the pawn on e4 actually shuts the bishop and the queen in. So there are no lines where the bishop can actually, play bishop h7 check and kind of jettison itself, so that the knight can actually block on d4 with my bishop c5 idea. So yeah, it's just a huge, huge turn of events, because in this position, you pretty much need to take the rook on e5, and after d takes e5, bishop c5, he can't actually do anything to shut down my bishop on this diagonal. Note that if the e-pawn wasn't here, there would be some option of playing knight d4 and bishop h7 check, and then giving up the rook for the bishop. But in this particular scenario, that's just not possible. So the other thing is, well, what if you ignore the rook on e5? Well, you could play a move like knight f4, but now rook g5 comes in, and if knight g2 blocking the check momentarily, I can actually just take on g2 and now go queen h2 check. And you could see here that the pin on the g file prevents the white rook from capturing, and black's essentially going to take material and checkmate very quickly, because now I'm just securing the rook on g2, and the king can't even run away through this diagonal because I have bishop f4 check. So yeah, he pretty much is obliged to take the rook on e5. And after d takes e5, bishop c5, we basically have a scenario where I'm a rook and a piece down. So a rook and a knight down, but it just doesn't matter, because the threats to the king side are just decisive. And note how the bishop here is just extremely clumsy, and it's in the way of white, shuttling the queen over to support the king. And it's not the first time I've mentioned this, but in many, many attacks, often it's that the queen is actually too far from the king to support the defense, and that actually makes it decisive. And here is no different. So here, Moiseenko decided to play knight d4 and give one of his pieces back just to try and reinforce the f2 rook. And so, of course, I took on d4 with bishop takes d4, and I'm still a rook down here, but, I'm still have all this pressure on this pin on f2, and white still has to deal with it, because my immediate threat now is queen g3 check. And the king can't go to f1 because my bishop is holding the square. The king would have to go to h1, and then I can play bishop takes f2 and recover the rook for free. And given how many pawns up I'm already up right now, I have 3 more pawns than white. If I get my rook back, it's completely winning. So white tried to hold this position together by playing rook d2, protecting the rook on f2 horizontally. And here actually was one of the first serious thinks I made during the game, believe it or not, because I'd had the sacrifice worked out. Rook e5 I was aware of as a concept, and here's a question of actually converting the win, because I could potentially entertain taking on f2 and winning in a position like this where I'm a piece down but have so many pawns. But this would give white chances to claw back in the game, because I would need to get my rook in the game to finish things off. And white may have some vague chances of surviving. So I wanted to play in a very, very clean way here that actually, secured me the win and really was just the most direct. And so my initial thought here was to actually bring my rook into the game. I thought that if I go rook e8 and then rook takes e5 and rook g5 check, that would be probably decisive. And I wasn't totally sure what white's next move would be, so I thought, this probably should get the job done. But then the more I looked at the position, I thought maybe there's something even cleaner, even more effective. And after about 15 to 20 minutes of thought, I actually realized that I don't even need the rook on a8 to finish the game off. And so it's actually this move that I'm actually most proud of in the game, besides, rook e5 notwithstanding. It's actually the move here that I played first, queen g3 check. And queen g3 check is not a move that, you might consider automatic, because I'm actually voluntarily pushing the king out of the pin on this diagonal. So it's like, why am I doing that? Why am I forcing the king to h1? Well, it's because after king h1, here's the move in queen g3 in conjunction with my next move that really I think is the kind of the all-star move of the game, and it's the move bishop g4. And the reason this move is so critical is because now white's king is trapped in the box in the corner, and it has no squares. And if I'm able to levy another check against it, it's probably going to be mate. So again, you could consider bringing the rook around, and that would take some time. But what I realized here is that this rook on f2 is actually shielding some very, very important squares from my queen and bishop. And in particular, right now it's the g1 square. So you can imagine if the rook on f2 is gone, queen g1 is mate. And because of that, if I'm able to play bishop f3 check, the position would just be over, because you can't take on f3 because queen g1 is mate. And so this presents huge problems, and there's actually no way to stop this bishop f3 check. Now, the other thing you might, consider is a move like rook g2, which, maybe prevents this this queen g1 mate scenario. Well, the other problem is that the h file is very vulnerable as well. So now I can go queen h4 check, and after rook h2 only move to block, I actually have queen e1 check. And the issue is that the king can't step up to g2 because queen g1 is still mate. Note that the bishop controls these light squares, and then the queen does the rest. And so really in this position, bishop f3 is a massive threat, because I have an ability to get to g1 by force, sort of whichever way white tries to defend. And so the issue here is that this rook is actually completely frozen. And if you actually put this into an engine, the move the computer recommends, which just shows you just how bad and fatal the position is, the computer suggests queen d1 is the only way to prolong the game. And of course, that would just lose the queen. So here, after bishop g4, it's actually the cleanest and most decisive way to win the game. And it's quite remarkable, because you can see the rook on a8 is at home and is actually not needed. Who would have thought? So anyways, after bishop g4, white actually went bishop f1, but it was quite clear from my opponent's body language that he realized the significance of the threats in my position, and the next few moves were just a formality, because now after bishop f1 I played bishop f3 check, and again rook takes f3 is impossible on account of queen g1 mate. So the only move to block this bishop f3 check besides rook takes f3 is bishop g2. But actually, first, before we go to bishop g2, Rook g2 also fails because of queen h3 mate. And you can see here that the pins are just too much for white to handle. This is probably one of the strongest bishop pairs I've ever seen. So anyways, after bishop f3 check, bishop g2 was played, trying to, shut down this diagonal for the time being. But now I realized, well, I'd realized a few moves ago, but now I realized, was I going to be able to play this really spectacular mate? And I got kind of excited. I thought for like 2 or 3 minutes just to kind of double check what was happening here. Because you can note that it looks like a lot of my pieces are hanging. And now I actually played the move queen h3 check, and you can see another piece looks like it's hanging. But the issue here is that the bishop cannot capture the queen on h3 because of yet another pin with my light squared bishop. So queen h3 check is just decisive. And in fact here, if the king scoots over to g1, queen takes g2 is actually mate because of the other pin that the dark squared bishop is levying on the g1 a7 diagonal. So actually after queen h3, my opponent actually resigned. And actually just for fun, I'll show you king g1, queen takes g2 would be mate. So yeah, this after queen h3, my opponent resigned, and I just couldn't believe it because basically what had happened during the course of this game was I was able to play an idea that I'd looked at quite extensively many months before this game. I remembered the idea, and he basically walked into every theme that I'd actually looked at under close observation. And that's extremely rare. It's pretty much like, it's pretty much like waking up and knowing exactly what someone is going to do in the morning. It's like you know what they're going to eat for breakfast, what time they're going to jump in the shower, what clothes they're going to put on, when they're going to go to work. I knew everything to a T in this position, and miraculously I was able to actually manifest that over the board. And so I was extremely thrilled with the game, and it very, very quickly became a sensation. I was, of course, getting a lot of messages on Facebook and Instagram and elsewhere about the game. I think it blew up a little bit on social media, and it was really amazing to have all this attention around a spectacular game and a spectacular upset. This is a guy that was ranked over 200 points higher than me, rating-wise, and was once top 20 or top 30 in the world. So it was just a huge honor to have a lot of attention around a game that I'd played, because that's not something that happens every day. So that being said, there were still, after this game, I was 4-0, and there were still 6 rounds to go. So you can imagine you play this really, really brilliant game, probably the most spectacular game you've ever played, and there's all this attention around it, but you still have a lot of work to do. And so my goal over the rest of the tournament was actually to kind of lock in even more and not try to focus on all the outside noise that was happening as a result of this game, because I knew that the job wasn't done. And so I knew there would be more tough games, more tough opponents, and this was just the beginning. All right, that's it for this one. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.